two, one, two, three.
Hi, and welcome to DSA Presents. My name is Ellen David Friedman. I am here today with author, activist, troublemaker, and jack of all trades, Mitch Troutman. Mitch has written a really stunning and superb piece of labor history that most of us will not have heard anything about. It is eye-opening, and it is called The Bootleg Coal Rebellion. It is about a period of history in which coal miners, workers in some of the most desperate, stressful, and violent conditions, were able to take control of the means of production in their industry, something that almost never happens in our world, certainly in US labor history, and chart a course for themselves that is incredibly inspirational today. So, Mitch, we are so happy to have you here, and interested in having you talk about this book, and then maybe spend a little time before we're done thinking about how some of the themes, the principles, and simply the stunning capacities that show up in this book can be applied to the current moment in US labor history and US labor. So, Mitch, why don't we start with this? You want to talk a little bit about your own kind of origins in the anthracite coal region in Pennsylvania, how this became interesting to you, and how the work proceeded into this book.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so the Bootleg Coal Rebellion about bootleg coal, illegal mining. And I grew up in the area where this happened, but I didn't know this history, and hardly anybody around me knew it either. I mean, people knew some people who are still mining know some of the technical aspects that were passed down, but nobody really had a hold of how big it was, you know? We all knew there was some illegal mining back in the day, but there's no book written on it. There was only like a few pages in other books about it. And so I don't know. I got interested because there's a lot of thing in the coal region, which is I'm talking about the anthracite coal region. So central northeast Pennsylvania. It's actually fairly close to Philly, Baltimore, and New York. Um, and there's a lot of things there that are really weird that people think are normal. Um, and it's like, for instance, like house fires, like very frequent house fires. There's old electric, old wood houses in row homes, take out whole rows. And it's sad, but it happens a couple times every winter. That like a whole road gets taken out. But that is tragic, but it's seen as normal. And so when I was living out there a couple years ago, I started doing this blog where I was just trying to reflect those things back to people, like, hey, if I write it in a slightly different light, doesn't that actually seem kind of odd to you? And one of the things I dug into was bootleg coal mining and how today we treat the old coal lands like they belong to everybody, like a commons in some way, which people mostly use for partying, picnics, or whatever, off-roading. But as I dug into bootleg coal mining's history back during the Great Depression, I came across, I like hit a wall. I could only find so much, and put an article out. People were really into it, kept going viral locally, and I wrote it under a pen name, and I kept hearing people talk about it, which was a great sign. Uh, but then a friend of mine encouraged me to keep digging, and I did, and I found that there was a guy named Michael Kazora who's trying to write a book about bootleg miners in the late 80s, early 90s. He also is a descendant of bootleg miners, and he did all these interviews with some of the last remaining people alive from this time. Not that there aren't people alive from the Great Depression now, but not coal miners, right? And he did 40 of these interviews and started to write before he got in a car accident and died. And then all these years later, I managed to track down his widow's phone number, call her. She had saved all his stuff. A little bit of it was in a library, most of it was in her basement, and she was like thrilled that somebody else wanted to pick it up. And I was, thrilled to get a hold of it. And uh, I had no intention of writing a book until I found those. And, other people's encouragement, I started thinking of it that way and trying to take all this oral history, like, I don't know, 50 hours worth of it, and try to like get a narrative out of what these people were saying all these years later. Um, and when I think back on that took me like a year or two, while I was doing other work and things. But when I think back on it, the thing that stands out most from all those recordings is not one of them would admit they stole anything, right? They would say, "Oh yeah, well supposedly it was their land," things like that. But they saw what they did was totally justified. And I guess just a little 101, the companies closed down the mines in a lot of these towns that had little other employment aside from textile mills, which didn't pay very well. Uh, Miners went onto the company lands that had the mines closed and dug their own mines or broke into the existing ones and started mining coal on their own and selling it where they could. And as times grew more desperate, Great Depression hits, it just keeps expanding until there's I think at peak there's about 7,000 miners working underground, and then 14,000 total if you count people processing it and trucking it around. And it becomes this huge illegal industry that has immunity from the local police in a way because local courts wouldn't convict people anymore, or the jails got too full sometimes. And then immunity with the state police, who were afraid that if they went in, it would look something like Blair Mountain did, in West Virginia, that these people are desperate and armed and have dynamite, right? And it's the Depression. They have a million other things going on. They said to the coal companies, reopen the mines and it's over, that wasn't compatible with JP Morgan's profit motive in what they were doing in the industry. So that's that's one of the best nutshells I've given on this actually so far. It's hard to be concise sometimes.
No, it's a great nutshell. And again, just to sort of underscore that what we're talking about here and what your research led you to is this period of history in which thousands of skilled, but let's say not worldly workers, right? Many of the people in this region were born and raised, maybe several generations of coal miners, living in great isolation because often just the terrain means you're not traveling that far. Poor roads, very mountainous, lots of limitations, and yet somehow they found it not only necessary but possible to do the thing that many of us on the left consider to be the most important and audacious thing, which is to violate the rule of private ownership of property. And again, just to make clear, most of the coal in this region was owned by a kind of hegemonic corporation, which owned both the coal mines and the rails. It would be good to hear you talk about that. And behind it was JP Morgan. So if you just want to talk a little bit about the sort of the forces, the power that they were up against, how that power exerted itself against them and how they resisted it.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly cover that in the book, but it could absolutely be its own book and maybe is in some ways. But JP Morgan controls the industry, mostly not through direct ownership. So the company that is most prominent in the book in this history is Reading Anthracite. They go by various names that change over time, but Reading Anthracite, those two words are always in it. Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, I think, isn't that a monopoly? I'm not sure. But Reading Railroad. Anyway, that goes like that corporation, that money goes all the way back to the people who killed the Molly Maguires 50, 60 years before this, right? And also the rail and the coal had both been monopolized in their own ways, and so had dealt with all the antitrust stuff that came from like the progressive era too. And so every time that they got hit with this antitrust stuff that like bans certain practices and certain types of ownership, they reorganized and still operated the same way. And so by the 30s, there's a whole interconnected web of companies. The state actually mapped it out, and it looks crazy. Called an interlocking directorate, which means that every company has their board of directors, and these companies are nominally independent. They just so happen to have the same board members as all the other coal companies and rail companies, but not exactly, different configurations. There's a lot of people involved, but they all know what the game is. They all know what they're trying to do with the money, which in this case is get out of anthracite coal. They see the industry, it's actually at its peak when they see that it's going to start to decline, or they think so because of oil. And so they first start trying to funnel the money into the railroads, right? Because even the mines that the JP Morgan cartel didn't control still had to sell to the railroads there, so they could set really high prices at the railroads and really low prices at their own mines, and say, oh, our mines aren't profitable, and shift that into the rails. But their other way of remaining profitable while getting out of the region was closing down the least efficient collieries, coal mines, and building new, like super efficient, mechanized, automated collieries. And when shutting them down, the key was that Reading owned so much of the land, and they would refuse to sell it to anybody else. That way, they could keep a control on output of coal, and thus keep control of the price. And so, when people were left stranded, with so these companies also a lot of times controlled the infrastructure of these towns. The company and the town grew up together. And some towns, they controlled the water supply, and when they split, no more water. In others, they're the ones who maintained the roads, things like that. And so when these companies leave and then refuse to sell to anybody else, like the middle class runs around trying to get investors, other people interested in buying coal mines. Oh, I know this one company owns a mine that's doing pretty well, like a few counties over, like maybe they'll invest, but no, Reading won't sell them the land, nor will, there's a few other companies who also owned by JP Morgan are involved in this too. Yeah, and that's really where like things are headed during this time. And so it's not just shutting down, it's also the automation, which is really similar today in a lot of ways, it feels like. There had been strip mining before, but now strip mining has gotten, like now in the 1930s, strip mining has gotten advanced enough that it's pretty profitable to use, and you can get the same amount of coal with like 5 people as you need 100 people to do underground, right? So they're shifting more to that. There's new machinery that can like pick train cars up and stuff like that. Wild. And then what the bootleggers end up doing is using what you can think of as the most primitive methods of digging coal. They're pretty technical. They're like fairly advanced in how they've figured out how to use them. But at the end of the day, it's human powered for the most part. I mean, their big invention was hooking a wire up to a wheel of a Model T and using that to pull the bucket and the people up and down the mine. But aside from that, we're talking picks and shovels, dynamite. Yeah, and two drastically different industries. And so at the peak of bootleg coal, they're producing about 10% of all anthracite coal. And the largest single anthracite coal company is also producing about 10%, right? So through these primitive methods and just like sheer numbers, they're really equaling. And not to mention, nobody's trying to arrest the regular coal companies for doing business. It's it's incredible. It's why I had to write a book about it, because it's just wild, the scale of it.
So the scale is wild. And again, just to underscore some of the principles that we see at work in different ways, but in the present economy, is the tendency under capitalism for monopoly to develop. And in this case, as you point out, its monopoly on anthracite coal in this region, and also monopoly on transportation through the rail, and monopoly on finance through the ownership and investment of JP Morgan. And so, again, just so we understand, there are strategies always that the capitalists are forcing on us of disinvestment. And when we think about the Depression, one of the things that it's hardest for us to kind of grasp is, well, there was fruit and vegetables rotting in the fields and on the trees. There was wheat and corn in silos that was just rotting, would not be sold. There were people starving, close to starvation, massive food kitchen, efforts going on to keep people from starving. So it is never simply a question of the market solving problem. It is the opposite of that. The market has got one goal only, and that is to make sufficient profit. And so the owners of Reading Anthracite and JP Morgan decided that in order to make the profit margin they needed, it was totally acceptable to leave coal in the ground and to leave thousands of miners and the families that depended on those miners absolutely destitute. We see that a lot, but again, the audacity and the sheer courage. I think it goes without saying that people understand there was a lot of violence used always against coal miners, both in anthracite and in the other coal regions in the country. Could you talk just a little bit about something that many of us may not know about, which is the coal and iron police, who were not, we sometimes think of these private, like mercenary security forces, like the Baldwin Felt cops. But the coal and iron police were kind of quasi-public, right? And they were designed to kind of manage labor really in the field. Love to hear you talk
Yeah,
about it.
yeah, absolutely. So this book took me years to write, and I was constantly coming across things that intersected with things that were happening currently, and one of these that intersects the book in a bunch of ways that I don't really write about is the murder of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. Partly because there were Black truckers from Baltimore who were part of the bootleg coal movement, and like that connection is gone, but also because Pennsylvania is like where in the US they were experimenting with police forces that evolve into what we have today, right? And so the coal and iron police, they're employed by the company, but the company is chartered to appoint cops, basically. And so they have the power of government, the coal and iron police do. And they, on a normal day might, just police like police normally would, obviously with siding on the company's side, right? But would get involved in other crime as well. But then when it came to labor, they could just arrest people, right? And so this is around for a long time. They're really hated, obviously, right? They're really hated. They're again, they killed the Marley McGuires. They committed the massacre at Latimer before this. So, but they're so in 1902 there's a huge anthracite strike, the Great Anthracite Strike, whatever, notable in like general labor history, and afterwards there's a fight in the state house to get rid of the coal and iron police, and it fails. They're not able to, but what they do instead is set up the first state police in the country, right? And then it's sort of this thing where over the next couple of decades, the state police slowly gain power and the coal and iron police slowly lose power. And by the time of the bootleggers, the coal and iron police are fairly weak. There's not as many of them. And then the one of the New Deal governors just refuses to charter anymore. It's not in his power to abolish them, but he just refuses to create any new ones. And then the next governor finally does abolish them. And the only thing left is the state police. And so the companies still have these cops, but now they're only guards, right? They no longer have the power to take somebody to jail or police anything that's not on their property, right? but then the state police are weird too, because like today I kind of just think of them as like I don't know, they're everywhere, they're nowhere. Like you might know a local cop, but you don't know the state police, you know. They patrol highways, you know, they're kind of anonymous. Um, but back then they were also like an anti-labor force. You had to be a single male under a certain age to be in the state in the original Pennsylvania State Police, because they didn't want people with attachments, you know. And there were only about 300 of them or so, but they would ship them to wherever there was labor issues in the state. And they were basically the governor's personal police force, right? So they were totally political. Um, but then I think I said already though, like there's a truce during the bootleggers' time where the state police won't interfere with bootlegging. They will police other things, but again, because there's not that many of them, and because it's like somewhat political, they're barely around. And once in a while, when the bootleggers get violent, in terms of blowing up machinery and things like that, at first the state police, they'll like be there in the background, you know, like because the unwritten agreement was as long as you don't shoot people, the state police will stay out of it. And so they're kind of just on the sidelines waiting. But then things really heat up right before World War II, and some of the miners in Schuylkill County really kind of go on a rampage of blowing up company machinery. And at that point, there are people shot, and the state police step in. Um, but again, there's too many bootleggers for them to really be that aggressive. The police were mostly able to just rescue some company guards who were in
And
trouble.
and you know, in truth, I think there was some kind of wide recognition that what the bootleggers were doing was sort of essential activity, right? They were trucking coal to all the major cities in the Northeast, as I understand it, and Baltimore, Philly, New York, Boston, and people needed coal, and the economy was not providing what they needed. Um, Mitch, in the last few minutes that are left to us today, I know time has flown. I'd love to hear you talk about this amazing principle that evolved again as a piece of labor history we should all know about, but do not, which is the way in which these bootleg coal miners distributed the revenue from their work, which was on a principle that they called equalization. And if you can dig into that a little bit, I think it's be fascinating for people to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are kind of two forms of that. Among the bootleggers, they split their pay evenly amongst partners, which you could call a cooperative. That's not how they thought of it, but it basically was. Um, and they split it evenly, regardless of who owns equipment or things like that, because they saw it as not a business but survival, and that they were all taking the same risk of arrest, of death, right? And they were all putting in their own labor, and that's what to them justified them taking the coal at all. Wasn't property rights or theft. It was like, no, it's our own labor that did it. It's our own risk that did it. And so that's really why sharing profits evenly were, well, profits is a weird term. You know, it's weird how modern economists have infected our brains with all these concepts that really just try to flatten things into businesses, like everything's a business. Um, but then the other side, the equalization movement was within the union, within the United Mine Workers, in places where there were still some mines open, but lots of unemployed. Um, and it was basically a joint employed unemployed movement to employ everyone part time. So the full timers, the people technically still employed, would strike after working a certain number of hours to force the company to either bring in the rest of the people or reopen another mine to employ the rest of the people. And there was like one corner of the region where this was successful all through the Depression, despite the company absolutely hating it. You know, rule number one for these companies is we run our own businesses. You know, we decide who works and when. And I just lost track. Sorry.
That's okay. Well, just to sort of pick up the thread,
Yeah.
because you hit on these important things. And again, for people who may be listening and know something about the contemporary labor movement, there is often, we need unions. We know that unions protect us. They defend something about our standard of living, but our unions often replicate the same principles of hierarchy and domination that exist in the corporations and that exist in government. So often the principles of, more highly skilled people will be paid more than less skilled or less trained people with greater seniority will be paid more. We defend those in the modern labor sense, but the incredible commitment to egalitarianism that was present at this moment is really sort of breathtaking, and again shows us that if you have taken yourself outside of the corporate model and the idea of private ownership of property, then a different kind of world opens up, right? So would it be correct to say the bootleg miners, they would find a coal hole, they would start digging, sometimes it would be with their kids, the wives, and a couple of friends. They didn't think it was therefore their mine. It was their work, but is that correct? They didn't get confused and think.
I mean, we can split hairs because, like, if somebody else tried to go in their mine and mine that coal, then there was trouble.
Then it was theirs.
But but no, they didn't declare the land to be theirs. They didn't then build their house next to it. No.
Yeah.
But yeah, the level of solidarity is like really incredible, and I still like feel like I lack words to describe like some kind of special features it has. But like the remarkable thing is that it wasn't based in ideology so much as it was based in community and survival. And this like rejection of corporatism. Not like out of principle per se, but out of like, no, we have to choose. It's either the corporations or us, and so we're choosing right now,
I'm going to take the last minute to just send a little bit of inspiration to the audience to say that as Mitch knows, I happened to have the opportunity to have been in West Virginia just about 2 weeks ago, working with teachers who were feeling very, very desperate about their work in public schools, which have been deeply disinvested for the past 20 or 30 years. We talked about this book. They were on fire about this book. And we entered into, and they've entered into a conversation about what would it mean to try and bootleg education, bootleg public education. And they're beginning to work this concept. So I just want to thank you, Mitch, on behalf of what you have done for those of us who will learn from this book, but also how it can inspire and open up new terrain for people who are in struggle now. This has been DSA Presents. Mitch Troutman, author, activist, troublemaker, jack of all trades, and I am Ellen David Friedman. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 3.